let's start. We have the enormous pleasure and honor to have with us Ms. Anne Leckie, the author, as our guest of honor at Eikon. Welcome, Anne, and we'll read to talk to you about how it is to translate you. So let me ask you, first of all, please, Anne, what have you got against translators? Not answer that. Let me put it a bit more politely. Are you aware that you are an extremely difficult author to translate?
I am, yes, I am aware that I'm but it's not on purpose, I promise. I just sit down to write a story and I go, oh, this will be interesting. And then I discover I've made things very, very difficult for Emmanuel.
Right, so you did. Anyway, the thing about your universe, I mean the Raj universe, sorry, is gender related. And it's, okay, let's make the distinction which has become a bit fuzzy recently. Gender is a grammatical term which relates to the differences between males, females and others in language, rather than sex, which is the physiological term. And it's a bit unclear whether the difference is really in gender or does it have anything to do with sex?
So the Rachai are human, like all of us here, and so they have all the variety of human bodies that we have with all the various differences. That's a huge spectrum of kinds of bodies. It's just that they don't divide up society or language in those terms, so they don't care. Sometimes I talk about it like we think of hair color, right? We all here have different hair colors, but we don't divide up pronouns depending on somebody's hair color, or say brunettes obviously are meant to like home and romance and cooking, and blondes obviously are more logical and, you know, do technical things and are better at math. We don't do that. It would seem ridiculous to us. So to the Rajai, to say, well, you have a body shaped like this, that must mean you have to have this kind of life or these kind of talents, would seem ridiculous to them. And so when they divide up language, that's just not something that's part of their mental furniture. It's not part of how they see the world. But they're human like we are, and they have all the kinds of people that there are, just like us.
Then how do you explain, I mean, in human society as it is today, sex matters a great deal, and therefore gender reflects it. Does sex matter to them at all? Because in any human society, we know there are gender differences in their languages, as far as I know. Maybe somebody will pick up some Inuit language where this is not so, or one of the languages in New Guinea, but in the major ones, in the civilized, or as you put it, Rajai languages, there's always a gender difference. Why isn't there among the Rajai?
So, to be honest, I don't know. The gift of being a science fiction writer is I can just say, it's 10,000 years in the future, and this is how things are. And I don't have to think about why or explain it. So that is the big gift of being able to write far future science fiction. There are I believe Finnish and Hungarian don't use gendered pronouns for people. I don't know if they have neuter pronouns for objects. So like English has anything that's an inanimate object, most of you, because you're listening to me speak English, so you already know this, there's a neuter pronoun for it. I don't know if Finnish and Hungarian have that neuter pronoun, but I know they only use one pronoun for human beings. Which is kind of interesting, but as you say, their society doesn't necessarily reflect it. So even though they have a language where you don't have to call it out with everything, it's not like men and women are totally equal and nobody knows the difference. It's not like that. And I'll be honest, I have no idea how we would get from here to the Rajai. In some ways, it would be better if we didn't get to the Rajai. Although I have to admit, when I sat down to write, I said, wouldn't it be cool? Because we live in a world where people look at you and put you in this category, and then they treat you according to that. And I said, wouldn't it be cool if that wasn't a thing, right? And I want to write a society like that. And then I had to complicate it by making it a really awful society in other ways. And so I just started out from there with no logic to where it was going to go. But you're right, it is very different to the way things are here in pretty much any society I know of. Even when they don't call out the difference linguistically, there's a social difference.
And to other societies in your universe, because Breck has the same problem that I had when she had to speak another language. She had to figure out whether she's talking to a male or a female, and she can't easily work it out, or can't at all work it out, and she finds herself in a bind over this. So, I mean, some societies have evolved in this way, and some haven't. But you dropped a number, 10,000 years. Is this your time framework? Because when I translated your books, I had a feeling that this is the future history most distant from us today than anything else I've read. I mean, Asimov's trilogy is a near future in comparison, isn't it?
Yeah. When so those of you who've read the book may remember there's a song. There are a lot of songs in the book. There's one song near the end that's used as kind of like a password, right, to access and control. That's a real song. That's a real song that exists. It's a medieval French song. And one of the things I didn't have to, but one of the things Breck says about that song is that the language that it's sung in has been dead for 10,000 years. And that language is medieval French. So I'm thinking way distant in the future. French has not been a language anyone has spoken for 10,000 years.
Right, but still, let's digress a little in the direction of a timeline. What you have is the Raj itself is a Dyson sphere. Okay, when we try to look realistically at the world we live in, a Dyson sphere may be 10,000 years in the future.
If ever, yeah.
If ever, but I mean in terms of technology, bear in mind that an Evans ring world is a very crude, very primitive, very partial version of a Dyson sphere. And you know all about that. So, in your universe, this Dyson sphere is so remote from the outreaches of the empire where the plot takes place that most people haven't been ever near it. So I get a time frame of hundreds of thousands of years, and then we have to assume during that period of time, and let me remind you that Homo sapiens exists for 100,000 years. There has been no physical evolution of the human species. There's a lot of technological evolution, but people remain people, not only in terms of their physiology, even in terms of the humanity. What was your take on this?
I have to admit, I kind of pretended that wasn't an issue. But you're right. Over that period of time, well, I think over that period of time, people remain people, but there are going to be changes over that period of time. But I think even in the far future, if people go to space and change their bodies very drastically, like the people who Breck meets, who live in a station with basically very little or no gravity, who may have 6 arms and no legs. They may be sort of shaped like snakes or fish or something because they don't have to walk around. They're still human beings. They're still people who think kind of like we do and count as belonging to the same category as human beings.
Because I have the sense that if there's one word to describe the central theme, the central pillar of the trilogy, it's humanism, which turns out, we agreed that we are allowed to use spoilers with respect to the trilogy. Turns out that even artificial intelligences can be human, maybe even more human than some human beings, some Homo sapiens. So, is that a basic that you knowingly and deliberately developed in your series?
I guess it's a basic assumption that I start out with, which is, it sounds like it shouldn't be a strange thing to say, but all people are people, right? And not objects or, toys or possessions or, and I guess I started out with that assumption and was thinking of the artificial intelligences, and Breck in particular. Breck says all the time, I'm not human, and she's not human, but she's still a person. But she'll say, I'm not a person. And so I guess when you start there, you have to end up saying, well, what is a person? And what does that mean when you say everyone here is a person, even if other people don't think they are? And so when I got to the end of the trilogy, I wasn't sure. I knew where I wanted to end up, but I wasn't sure how I was going to get there. And it was the second to last chapter when I suddenly realized that basically Breck had to stand up and make a formal claim. No, we're people, and you have to treat us like people. And I said, oh, obviously I was heading here the whole time, but I didn't realize it when I started writing.
That's interesting, and this reminds me, I hope you don't mind being compared to J.R.R. Tolkien, who once wrote that while writing The Lord of the Rings, he had no idea what he was going to write in the next chapter. And so he went along throughout, and then looking back, it turned out that everything was developing in and of itself. Because the second time I read the last book, Answer and Mercy, there was a build-up to the climax that you just mentioned, very obvious that, I was surprised right now because I can't believe it wasn't deliberate.
It was not deliberate. It was not, I had, the chapter before that is, I knew that I was almost at the end of the book. And I knew the deadline was coming up too, right? And I thought I have to figure out, the book ends in the next chapter. It has to, because that's, there's a particular length, and I felt like it was almost the end. And so when Breck decides to go back to the station and trade herself for Sivarden, and I thought, and I'm just putting her further into the fire, and no end in sight. And I wrote the scene where they're in the shuttle going to the station and having the conversation about the song with the 99 eggs, or it's 1,000 eggs to make it even more annoying. And I was like, well, that's a very funny scene. I like it, but I don't know what's going to happen now. And all of a sudden I just went, oh. But it wasn't until I wrote that scene that I knew what the next chapter was going to be, and then I saw the rest of the end of the book. But you're right, it's like seeing something that was already there. right? It was already implied by everything else that I had already written. I just didn't know it until I saw it.
Well, the way I look at it, human can be either, or well, maybe both things, a person of the human race and someone or something with qualities that we fancy a human race is endowed with at its best. And it's human, Breck is human in the second sense, even if not in the first one. And those people at the station where she arrives right after the explosion of their ship are also like that. They're kind. On the other hand, the translators, they are physically human, as far as anyone can tell, but they are as far from humans as can be. There's no figuring out how they think, right?
Yeah.
And, well, it makes for some very hilarious scenes, but I think there is a deeper meaning. Did you dig for that?
No, I didn't. That's a really interesting observation. I like that observation. I hadn't thought of it that way. I actually, primarily, the translators were brought on partly because I already had them in my head, and I was like, well, I want to put them on the page because they're fun, and to get the Presker, these mysterious aliens, more on the page. But then when I started writing them, they were just so fun to write. I had so much fun. And actually, when I realized, it's okay for spoilers for the trilogy, when I realized how short a time the first translator, I say Dlike, some people say Dlik. It's okay, any way you pronounce it is probably right somewhere in the Raj, just so you know. When I realized how short a time translator Dlike was going to be on stage, I was really sad because I really enjoyed writing her. So I promised myself I would put another translator in the next book for as much as I possibly could. So that was kind of why, like, Translator Zayat is there so often in the third book, was because I felt cheated that I couldn't put Translator Dlike on the page as much.
Back to where we started. Those who read in Hebrew rather than in the original will have noticed that the name in Hebrew is spelled Dlikwe. The reason being that if you write Dlike in Hebrew, it looks like a fire, as in arson.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Well, never mind that. Sfin, the other ship, in Hebrew, this gem is called Spina, which is very near Sfina, which is ship.
Oh, no!
Thank you for that.
I'm so glad I could make life interesting. You would have been so bored.
Right. Fun throughout. Okay, but, let's move a little. In a couple of hours, we are going to launch yet another book of yours, and we've agreed that there will be spoilers there. But it takes place in the Raj universe, but not in the Raj Empire.
That's right, yeah.
So let me ask you, are you thinking of writing any more in the same universe, maybe in the same empire?
Probably. I will almost certainly write something else in the same... Is it working now? Yes.
Yeah.
I will almost certainly write something else in the same... See, I was cutting out. I wonder if I hit the...
Yeah, you can hear it.
Hello, you can hear me? Okay. I will almost certainly write something else in the same universe. I don't currently know what that will be, but almost certainly something, because it's a nice big universe. There's a lot of room to do a lot of fun things, and I've already invested a lot in construction there, right? So I might as well take advantage of that. So I almost certainly will.
Great, looking forward to it. May I make a suggestion, please? I feel so bad about Brooke. And you do have some virginal AIs over which have to be imprinted with some kind of personality.
Ah.
Why not hers? Why not make her an AI then?
That's an interesting question, and I've had some readers ask me that question, and some readers who really have hoped that maybe the third book would end that way, and I don't really know. That's a thing I have to think about.
Yeah, because let me tell you, you keep going through this over and over again. When I was a sheep,
Yeah, she misses it very badly.
once I could do this, now I can't. Once I could have all that, now I can't. Yeah, you feel very, very bad about this when you read it. So, we are, I think, everybody here hoping for some redemption for her. To, relieve her misery a bit.
I have to think about that, because there are big questions about identity. So the person who Brecht's body used to belong to is no longer that person anymore. Will Brecht still be Justice of Turin if she's hooked up to a brand new baby AI, right? And she's already rejected losing her own identity when Dr. Strigan says, I can make you who you used to be. And Brecht says, no, I want to stay myself, right? And so that's a thing I kind of go back and forth about. Like, would she still be herself? If she wouldn't be, I wonder if she would want that or not. But you're right, she misses it really badly, and it's a big pain, a painful thing in her life.
What Strigan suggested was to bring back the person she was before she became an auxiliary, not bring her back to become a Justice of Turin again.
That's very
because
true.
She was.
That's very true.
So,
and it wouldn't have worked, which of course is what Tisarwat was about. The Dr. Strigan could not have brought back that previous person because that previous person was gone, right? And that's kind of why.
Okay, well, she claimed she could.
Yeah, she thought she could, but she didn't understand. Yeah.
Yeah, we did have a nice argument about Strigan, whether she's male or female.
To be honest, I don't know.
Yeah, that's the difference. Yeah. You don't know?
I honestly do not know.
Yeah, and I have to know.
I remember that email, and you said, I think I may have figured it out. And I'm like, well, all right, but I don't know. I don't know if,
Yeah, okay, but you see, we're going back to the question. Hebrew, we only have 2 genders. English, earlier we counted 5 in the new book and 4 in the trilogy. Mm-hmm. So, it's like map drawing. When you take the globe, which is round, 3-dimensional, and you have it to project it on a flat surface, something must be lost. No matter how you try, no matter how good you are, something will be lost. And let me tell you what that something was. In the last book of the trilogy, when Ananda takes over the station again, she's very careful to call Brecht it. There was nothing I could do about it. It had to be her, because otherwise it would have had to be him, which doesn't make any sense at all. So that's part of the thing, and here's where I wanted to try to get into your head and see, how do you really see the relationship between the way we speak and the way we think about life, the universe, and everything else?
I think there is definitely a relationship, but I think it's complicated. Because as I said, there are languages where human beings are all referred to by the same gender no matter what, by the same gendered pronoun, but those societies are not miracles of, gender egalitarianism. And so it's not a question of if you speak a language where gender is not an issue, then nobody will notice gender. It's not as obvious as that. But I do think that when the way that you speak is always enforcing those lines and putting people into certain categories, that's going to affect the way you see the world. For instance, English is not as strongly gendered as Hebrew is. We don't gender nouns, right? And very often for titles, I know in other languages if you say the doctor, you have to call out the gender of the doctor. In English, you don't have to do that. And yet, at the same time, in English, particularly in the US, but not just the US, if you were to say the doctor, which theoretically could be a man or a woman or somebody who's non-binary, or everyone's going to assume you're talking about a man, right? Because the man is the default. And there used to be, when I was very young, teachers would tell students, the expression was, the masculine embraces the feminine. So that when you were going, and I think this is similar in Hebrew, when you've got a group of people and it's mixed, you always say he. And people would say, in English it's the same way. It's not that they're being prejudiced and saying everyone's guys, it's just grammatically the masculine also includes the feminine. Except that's not the case, because when you say he, you think of a group of men, right? And I do think that shapes the way you think about the world, and that's part of why I chose to use she. Early on, as I said, I wanted to write a story about a society that did not care about gender, where those distinctions were absolutely meaningless, culturally and socially, to these folks. And so I started out writing another novel, not Ancillary Justice. I was afraid to write Ancillary Justice. I didn't think I could do it. So I was writing around the edges of Ancillary Justice. And I assigned binary genders to everyone and used he and she. And just said, oh, but they don't care about gender. But I realized I was putting characters in particular categories depending on what gender I had assigned to them. And I said, this will not do. I can't do this. And I thought, well, how am I going to make this work? So I actually wrote a short story, and thank God it was never published, where I used he for everyone and just said, but, you know, it's not that they're all men, it's just he is the pronoun. Except it read just like an ordinary science fiction story. Right? Just, you know, there's just a bunch of guys. Well, that's normal for a certain kind of science fiction, right? You'd think there were no women in the world. And I thought about, in English, there are some, they call them neopronouns, right, that various people use, but I was not familiar enough with them to feel like comfortable using them. I said, well, what if I use she? And in theory, it shouldn't be any different from using he, right? It should be the same, because the masculine embraces the feminine, and that's not really prejudiced against women, right? So if I use she, it'll just be the same, except it wasn't the same at all. And so I really do, and I've talked to a lot of readers. Well, actually, the interesting thing it did for me, I had started writing Ancillary Justice, assigning binary genders to the characters. So the first characters who appear in the first couple chapters, I had assigned genders to. And then I decided I was going to use she for everyone, and I went back and I rewrote it. And characters whose pronoun was now different, they changed in my head, the way that I thought about them. That was super weird to me, and that said to me, that's how powerful these tiny little words are. And it's been interesting to me the number of readers who have said, but if I don't know whether it's he or she, I can't imagine what the character looks like. Which, on the one hand, I understand, because I experienced that myself. On the other hand, it's not like all women look the same, right? When you say a person is a woman, that doesn't really tell you what they look like. And yet, when you speak a language where everyone has to be assigned, that becomes essential information that you feel there's something missing without it. So I do think that the way we speak really does influence the way we see, but I don't think it's as simple as if we all just use gender-neutral pronouns, we'll all be equal. I don't think it's that obvious.
Well, not equal, but look at the world from a slightly different angle. Let me tell you, a couple of years ago, we had, I think it was in this very room, a discussion on gender and language as expressed in your book. At that time, only Ancillary Justice was published.
Yeah,
And you were there, and it was perhaps the most awkward thing I ever had in 20 years of this convention. A lot of LGBT people came in because they saw language and gender. They haven't read the book. I asked for a show of hand, and a minority among the audience have read the book, and I was, what are we going to do? So I suggested, okay, let's make an experiment. All the males in the audience and myself, let's try to speak as females. It was very difficult. And some LGBT people got so mad that they filed a sexual harassment complaint against me. Really. Yeah, I mean, you know, people who claim equality and then demand their privileges. Okay, never mind that. But it was difficult. Henry, our publisher sitting here, will remember, hopefully, how I called him after Ancillary Justice was printed, because I used the Hebrew word for hospital, which is Beit Cholim, male, and it should have been Beit Cholot, feminine. You did correct it for in future edition, print runs, but it's that ingrained. The way we think about the world, I think, has to be affected whether our language has the tools or not. The difference is there, isn't it? So, shall we try to move on to provenance very carefully?
Yes, yes.
A theme there is the way people hang on to vestiges, to relics from their past or the people's past. Why is it so important?
I think it's important to people in general. I actually began wanting to write about, I sat down, I said, I need to write another book. I want it to be fun. And one of my favorite space opera tropes is ancient alien archaeology, right? The archaeological dig and the ancient alien relics that might be really powerful and mysterious. And so I said, all right, that's going to be what I'm writing about. And there's barely any of that in the book. I sat down to read about the history of archaeology, which when I was a little girl, one of the things I wanted to be was an archaeologist. The history of archaeology is really kind of interesting and is tied up with the history of anthropology. And I found the more I read, it was very much about people or governments establishing stories about where they came from. So archaeology often, the projects that governments and universities want to fund are the ones that are going to talk about where that particular culture came from, or where they want to claim they came from. And this ties in with looted antiquities, right? The British Museum. The Elgin marbles are never going back to Greece until the British no longer think of themselves as the heirs to civilization and Greece and Rome, right? That's why the Elgin marbles are never going back.
And Jerusalem.
And Jerusalem. Oh, the number of different groups who claim Jerusalem as part of their story of who they are is a problem, right? It makes life exciting. And so that really began to fascinate me, and instead of writing about the archaeology, I started writing about the collecting of things that were basically sort of certification for where you came from. Except the other thing about antiquities, right, is how many forgeries there are. Right? The number of things in museums that are forged or smuggled with fake provenances, with fake receipts about where they came from so that they can be legally smuggled out. And it's all about the story that various groups and people want to tell about who they are and where they came from and what their position should be in the world. And that became very fascinating to me.
In that sense, you are right, in the right place for this kind of thing, because in a major part, the claim of our people to this land is based on archaeology.
That's right, yeah.
There was this famous general, Moshe Dayan, who became an enthusiastic amateur archaeologist come antiquities thief. He would do illegal diggings all over the place, because for him it was the justification of his wars. He was fighting for the restoration of the kingdom of David and Solomon, which he could dig up and fill with his very hands. He said so many times himself. So he came to the right place.
Yeah. I think we all, even on a smaller scale, we all tell stories to ourselves about who we are. And when we lose that, that's very difficult. People who become refugees and they lose the little, this was my mother's ring and this was my grandmother's set of china and those things are gone. And you know that story, but it's like being cut loose from all your anchors and the things that tell you who you are and where you belong. And it's a really terrible, distressing situation to be in. So I think we all have that sort of storytelling, and then there are times when it has huge effects on the world. It's not just ourselves individually, but whole cultures and social groups who really desperately need to have, I think everyone has the right to have a story of where they came from and to have, some feeling of who they are and where they belong, right? It's an important human impulse, I think.
Yeah, especially when it's disputed.
Oh, yeah, and when it gets disputed, the disputes become very, very bitter, don't they?
You can say that again.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, stop me if you feel I'm spoiling anything, but we do have a big gender problem.
Yes,
with your book.
There is a gender problem in Providence. It's a big surprise, I know.
Well, you have those people who are neither males nor females or both. And one thing I couldn't figure out was whether it's physical or against only cultural linguistics.
So in this culture, children are considered genderless, and in English I use the pronoun they for children. And at a certain age, at whatever adulthood, usually it's late teens, but the cultural ideal is it's when the child feels ready. They declare their adult name and they declare what their gender is. So it's up to each individual to say, this is where I fit. Now, what I don't say in the book is I'm quite certain that that most kids grow up and the adults around them are, oh, they're going to be a woman. I know they are. And then you get pushed into, oh, they're going to be a Nemen. Isn't that adorable? They're such a little Nemen. They're going to grow up and be Nemen is the third gender, men, women, and Nemen. And I'm sure that exists because that's just a thing. They're human beings. But basically, kids grow up and choose their gender. So there may or may not be any correspondence with the things that we think of as being particularly gendered. But for their society, they know immediately when you meet another adult, you go, oh, that's a Nemen. The way that, in our society, we meet somebody and we go, oh, that's a woman. And maybe we're wrong, right? But we have these cues that tell us. But I actually never talk about those in the book. I don't mention them. I do not mention them. On the theory that when I'm writing about men and women, I don't mention it. I don't say, and this person was introduced to me, and I knew they were a woman because they had visible breast tissue and long hair and were wearing high heels. I mean, you don't do that, right? You just say, and a woman came over and spoke to me, right? And you might say, and she had long blonde hair to describe her physically, but you don't say, and I knew she was a woman because, right? You don't do that. And so I said, I know I'm going to make it confusing for the readers, but I'm going to treat people in this book that way. So I never, it's just, and a Nemen came up and spoke to the character, or, oh, there was a woman standing over there, and that's just, I don't explain any more than that.
Yeah, well, because right at the beginning, they open, they see a naked, unconscious person, and both the woman and the man present know at once that it's a Nemen.
And part of that is because they've already been talking about this person. And Ingrid, the main character, she's already told the man that the person in that pod, the person in the suspension pod, is a particular person, and she's used a particular pronoun. She's called E. E-M air is the pronoun that I used. And so Ingrid has been talking about M using that pronoun. And so they're already expecting, Ingrid and Tick, they're already expecting for this person to be a Nemen. But also, I don't doubt, there are some other cues as well. But I would not say, in this society, genitals are not a thing that tell you what gender someone is. Because children choose, right? I guess in the far future you could choose your genitals, which would be awesome, right? It would make life wonderful for a lot of folks. But this is a society where it doesn't necessarily match up. So, but that is a little confusing, and I knew it would be, and I have no mercy on my readers.
Yeah, your translators, right? At one point you mention Brechtel's Ananda to go fuck herself, and you mention in passing that she's one of the few people who could actually do that. Now I wanted to ask you about something else. You're very color sensitive. Throughout your books, everything is described in very vivid colors. The way people dress, the way they decorate their rooms or even their ships, everything is colorful. On the other hand, the persons are hardly described at all, how they look. I mean, we know Station Administrator Sela was beautiful because it was essential to the plot. We know that Ingrid was, let's say, plump, because she has a difficulty getting into
the space suit.
And Gal is very tall, so he has a similar difficulty. Other than that, we don't know how Brooke looks like, or Sevarden, or Strigan.
Well, we know Sevarden has a really distinctive nose. Actually, there's a passing because at one point Breck says when Sevarden was very young, she had a nose that she hadn't grown into yet when she was 17, right? But as an adult, it fits her. It's right.
Because that's part of her aristocratic.
Her very aristocratic looks, yes.
Yeah, it's essential to the plot, so you mention it. Otherwise, you don't. Is this deliberate?
So, just between y'all and me, right? I'm very bad at visual descriptions. I am not good at it. The reason I do so many colors is long ago when I was first writing that first novel that only a few people have seen, I was part of a critique group, and somebody read it and they said, I'm really enjoying this, but I feel like you've got your hands over my eyes the whole time. And I thought to myself, I have to fix this. So I thought, who does really good visual descriptions? Because for any of you all who are writers wanting to be writers, if there's a thing you want to learn, just take it from another writer, right? It's all there on the page. You can imitate, you can see how they do it. And so I said, you know who does really beautiful visual descriptions is Jack Vance, right? I love Jack Vance's stuff. And his visuals are beautiful. And so I read a bunch of Vance, and I said, so what is he doing? I have to analyze it. And one of the things Vance does is he uses so much color. He uses color everywhere, and just amazing colors. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about color and thinking about words for colors. And so when I'm describing a setting, I very deliberately decide what colors I'm going to use. I think about color schemes, and I think about trying not to repeat them and what's going to look really cool. And then apparently that shows up my deficiencies elsewhere in describing things physically.
The moon moth, right?
Oh, the moon moth is amazing. Any of you who have, if you haven't read the moon moth, it's really incredible. Yeah.
Anything by Vance.
Yeah.
You know, that's what they say, stealing from one is plagiarism, stealing from many is research.
Yes, that is exactly right, yeah.
Okay, so, you know something? I think I ran out of questions, so let's move over to the audience.
I have two things to say. First of all,
Louder,
Anne,
please.
Okay. First of all, Anne, you have a great short story called Another Word for World.
Oh, yes.
Which I really liked, and it's about translation problems.
Yes, it is. It absolutely is about translation
it's great.
problems.
Everyone should read it. It's really available.
It's free. It's in, so Microsoft, this person was saying, I have a short story called Another Word for World, and it's basically about translation problems. Well, they're nothing next to the translation problems I give to you. But what happened was Microsoft wanted to, for some reason, to have an anthology of stories that were inspired by the kinds of technology that they were researching. And so they had a number of authors. The anthology is really fabulous. It's got stories by David Brin and Nancy Kress, and it's just a great anthology.
Naomi Kreitzer, I think, right?
I don't know if Naomi Kreitzer is in it. Shauna McGuire's in there. No, Cat Pictures, Please wasn't in that anthology. And so they flew a bunch of folks out and said, you know, here's our research labs. But the thing that fascinated me was machine learning and machine translation. And so I said, what story am I going to get out of machine translation? And the story that came out was Another Word for World, in which the characters don't speak each other's language. They have like a little, they're sort of, shipwrecked isn't the right word, but their plane crashed and they have to depend on each other, and they lose the device that lets them translate, and discover when you make assumptions about what things mean and your machines are translating, but they're not maybe translating very faithfully. And so, yeah, that story is freely available, and I recommend the whole anthology to folks. It's really a great book, yeah.
Let me add very carefully, very cautiously, that you have a spot of hilarity in provenance on machine translation,
yes.
But let's end it here.
Yeah, that would be kind of a spoiler. There is a machine translation moment.
As a science fiction writer, do you have any background in science or
Not technically. My parents were biochemists at the Washington University Medical School, so I grew up. I was raised by scientists. It's not like being raised by wolves, but you know. And so a lot of like dinner time conversations were very sciencey, right? And people would always ask me, like in high school and college, why aren't you going into science like your parents? I know. But so I do have some of that, but I don't have a degree, right? My degree is actually in music. Yeah, that explains the song. In fact, I was saying earlier to some folks, almost the last song in the first book, the one that Anandar Mianai uses to control Breck, is a real song. That's the one that's the medieval French song. Yeah, and every now and then a reader will write to me and say, is that L'Homme-Armé? And I'll say, you studied music history. I know you did.
In the book, in History of Justice, there's somewhere relatively early. There's something that makes it pretty clear that they have the technology for that they have technology for reproduction that isn't that like external wombs or whatever. Was that I mean, from what you say, I assume it is. Was that okay? I know they're not gendered, and I want to get some kind of technological solution, or is this an assumption of like technological evolution? Like, is this like I need to maybe I want to solve a problem of how do they get to a society where sex and gender is irrelevant, or does it say I have the idea and therefore what should I do? You do with it?
It's kind of both. To some extent, the idea of the sort of uterine replicator, right, like in Bujold. Oh, the question was, I mentioned in passing in the first book that there is a way to have a baby that doesn't involve using a human body, that's sort of mechanical, like Bujold's uterine replicators, and did I do that to solve the problem of how we got a society where gender doesn't matter, or was it just a matter of technology? To a certain extent, it was just a matter of thinking that far ahead. That's probably a thing that, you know, would come along. I think a lot of us, I have 2 children, it might have been a little more convenient, right? And of course, Bujold deals very directly with that. And of course, I've read Bujold, and so I'm like, well, that's a given. Obviously, the future has this, right? But at the same time, you're absolutely right. When you don't have to actually be physically pregnant, that does change some things. I know sometimes as pregnant women get treated like they're super delicate and can't do anything, and we all know that's not true. But it's also true that that's a rough thing to go through, and when you've given birth, you kind of maybe, you know, need to have some time to recover from that. And it's super dangerous, like lots of women die, right? And so having that will, when that comes, when we have that, that will, I think, there will be social changes that will come from that. So it was sort of a combination, but I wasn't really trying to work that through. Yeah.
What other literature? What other literature or other sources inspired you in your world building, both regarding the gender agnostic world and generally?
So the question is, what other sources inspired me or helped me with world building and with writing generally, and
both regarding the gender.
Both regarding the gender. Not a lot regarding the gender, partly because it's so different from our world. A number of folks have asked me, was I inspired by The Left Hand of Darkness? And I knew about The Left Hand of Darkness, right? You all know about The Left Hand of Darkness, right? We all know about it. It's so famous that I already knew why I should have read The Left Hand of Darkness. And I knew that Le Guin had chosen to use he in a situation where her people were genderless, and that later she was unhappy with that choice. I knew that, and that was part of what I was thinking when I made my choice.
Did you read the story she wrote to remedy this?
I actually have not read the story she wrote to remedy it. Coming of Age in Karhid, right? It's so famous, I know about it, though. I had already begun to write Ancillary Justice when I finally said, this is ridiculous, I really need to read The Left Hand of Darkness, right? And if you haven't read The Left Hand of Darkness, y'all really should read The Left Hand of Darkness, it's amazing. Largely, though, when I want to do world building, I walk through the library and pull history and anthropology books off the shelf. And fortunately or unfortunately, since I'm not writing academically, I don't need footnotes, and so I don't keep a list of what I've read. But there are a lot of really amazing... The real world is more fantastic and diverse than I could possibly make up. And so often what I'll do is I'll pull a book off the shelf and read something about a society and say, oh, that's shiny. I'm going to put that in somewhere. And I end up with a big pile of shiny things, and I just kind of put them together. So almost any kind of thing that's happened in the past, history. The Roman Empire, obviously, was a huge model for the Raj. They've been a model for so much science fiction for obvious reasons, right? But really, you can't go wrong with reading any kind of history and anthropology. Yeah.
Some of transgender experience, if I'm allowed to speak as a cisgender person, is the dysphoria. And that's not always about the gender. It's about, I mean, from what I hear, it's also about how I feel in my body, which is completely different than how I feel in my responsibility in society. So I wanted to ask about, I don't remember it in the trilogy, but did you think about how dysphoria feels, how body image, even as a fat person or something like that, in this kind of society?
So the question is about, in this world, for instance, gender dysphoria isn't, being unhappy with the gender you've been assigned isn't always just about feeling in your mind that you don't belong in that category, but the way that your body is put together. And did I think about questions of body image in the trilogy? And the answer is actually no, not very much. And I wish I had thought about it more. I thought a little bit about standards of beauty. That's part of why Administrator Kellar, part of the reason that she is remarked many times as being so beautiful, and also that she's fat. Administrator Kellar is quite fat, and Breck says several times, like everyone on the station is half in love with her because she is so beautiful. That was important to me because I didn't want to make the assumption that whatever we considered to be beautiful would be beautiful 10,000 years in the future. And I also know that it's important when you never see yourself on the page as a valuable or beautiful, a beautiful being. And I wanted to do that. It wasn't until after the first book was published and so I saw some of my readers talking and they said, well, what about trans people in this society? And I thought, that's a really good question. And the more I've thought about it, there have to be trans people. As you say, there are people who their bodies feel that they feel their body needs to be different for them to feel comfortable, to feel who they are. And that, since that's a thing that happens to human beings, that's got to be a thing that happens to the Rachai. And I don't know if they wouldn't necessarily express that as I need to change my gender, but it's easily available to them to say, I need to change my body in this way to feel right. That's a thing that's available. But that's a thing that, because I'm a cis woman, it's a thing that hadn't occurred to me until I saw readers talk about it. And so that's a thing I still think about and I still wish I'd thought about more and maybe at least put some hints in as to how it is, because I know it's important to see yourself in the future, right? And when you write about the future and it's all white people, or it's all men, or it's all able-bodied people, or it's all thin people, that's really dispiriting. You feel like you have no place in the future, and it's really important to feel that way, to feel that you're going to be there in the future.
I don't know if you already sold your rights to make a movie or a series. Hope you do. But what do you think, or what do you prefer that the characters in that movie, that future movie or series, would look like? Part male, part female, androgynes, like Ziggy Stardust?
That's a really good question.
Because when I read it in Hebrew, because of Emmanuel, I thought about all of them as female. I couldn't picture any other than female, so I don't know how it will work on the big screen.
Yeah, so the question is about filming it, right?
Yeah.
How would you film it? How I can cheat on the page and not give and make descriptions that avoid particular cues that make people think, of a particular gender. On television and movie, that's very much more difficult, isn't it? So there is, at the moment, it's in a situation where I can't say too much about it. There's an option at the moment for a television show. Now the thing is, with options like this, 99% of these options never become anything, right? They expire, somebody else buys an option, the writer gets a little free money, and it never happens. But every now and then, I think, how would a television show handle that? And I don't know. I honestly don't. I think the Rachai should probably be mostly fairly androgynous or mix up gender cues the way we would see it. But I don't know 100%, and I'm not sure how a director or a producer would approach it. There's really a lot of room for really messing up bad, isn't there? It could really be terrible. In some ways, it might be best for them to just keep giving me option money and not actually make it. But I would love to see it actually on screen and work. But I don't know. I honestly don't know the best way to handle that. So it's a super interesting question.
Let me tell you one thing. Whatever you think you will see on screen, it will be the opposite.
Yeah.
On me? So I propose.
Can you tell us about a scene or a chapter that was especially hard for you to write in the trilogy?
Each book had scenes that were particularly difficult. But I think among the hardest this is a huge spoiler. Y'all have read the first book, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. The hardest thing to write, I think, in the whole trilogy was the scene where Lieutenant An dies. Partly because, of course, that's a very upsetting scene, but also because if that scene doesn't work, the whole story falls apart, right? And it's delayed until more than halfway through the book. And if the reader gets more than halfway through the book, and that scene happens and it doesn't work, then the whole book becomes ridiculous. Because it only makes sense, the whole story only makes sense if you understand how much Brecht loves Lieutenant An, and how traumatic this was that she had to do this. And I wrote that scene so many times, and it caused me so much anxiety, and it bothered me so much because I knew I had to get it right. But I think I mostly got it right. Because I do have people. Yeah, I've had people come and talk. I think I was telling you earlier, somebody came up to me at a convention and began to cry, telling me about how angry she had been and upset. She threw the book away from her, and she said, "I hated you." And I said, "I worked really hard to get you to feel that." and she was just crying, and I was like, "I'm sorry, but I'm also not sorry."
I just want to mention I cried this morning.
Okay. So I once read that there are two types of writers when it comes to planning the story. There are the architects who plan everything ahead, and then there's the gardeners who like invent as they went along. Like I know it's not like a black or white thing, but like do you think that you lean towards a certain type of writing when
I'm more, the other words I've heard is plotters and pantsers, right? Yeah, architects and gardeners, plotters and pantsers. I'm more of a gardener. I have never really been able to write an outline of a whole plot, but I do have to know where I want to end up, and I do have to have at least a few big steps along the way. But very often the spots in between those places are a complete mystery to me until I write them. And like the third book in the trilogy, I was saying I knew I wanted to end up with Brecht having been able to separate herself and maybe all of Athoag's system from the Raj. But I couldn't see how that was going to happen. But I knew that was where I needed to end up. And so it's kind of in between. I have a friend, Juliet Wade, who outlines very meticulously. And I said, how do you even outline? Like, how do you know what's going to happen until you've written it, right? And she said, well, what do you do? And I said, well, I know the beginning and I know the ending and I know some spots along the way. And she's like, Anne, that's an outline. So it's kind of in between, but more of a gardener. Yeah.
I have a question about world building. You said that that the Raj universe is where you did a lot of work already. How much is it really? How much do you know more than what you've written? For example, about the true Raj, the Dyson sphere, what happens inside, the history that brought this on.
I know.
How much do you know and are not telling?
I know a fair amount more. There are some gaps in my idea of the history of the Raj Dyson sphere, but I do know more than it is on the page. Occasionally readers will ask me if I'll ever write a story set there, and I don't know, maybe not, but I do know, in world building generally, I know a lot more than is actually on the page. I would bore everybody just putting everything that I had come up with onto the page, right? So I just kind of talk around it. But I definitely know more. I know way more about the Presker than will ever appear on the page. Because they won't be mysterious anymore. Right? If I bring them on stage, that's part of why I use the translators. The translators are fun, but I can never actually bring the Presker on stage because I'll trip over my own.
Let me do a follow-up on that. Brecht spent 20 years someplace called the Itran Tetrarchy.
Well, she wasn't in the Tetrarchy for all 20 years.
Whatever, she had...
I know a lot about that period in Brecht's life, and it's not on the page there.
She had marvelous adventures there.
Yes,
very dangerous, very lucrative. Why don't we get them?
Oh, Actually, that one is available. Y'all, there's a short story, you know about it, called She Commands Me and I Obey. And it was published at Strange Horizons. I wrote that while I was writing the novel because I needed Breck to have a lot of money, right? Just to make the plot work, right? And as I'm writing, it began to bother me. How did she get all this money? She was, just a piece of a spaceship. How does she have all this money? And I said, well, she has it because I gave it to her, right? I'm the author. But I needed to know why. And so I said, well, maybe I'll also write a short story, and then I can try and sell the short story. So I wrote the short story, She Commands Me and I Obey, and I sent it around to a bunch of places, and I got some very nice notes, and they all said, no, thank you. And I thought, well, that's life. When you're a writer, that's how you know you're a real writer, right? You get those rejection letters. And so after the first book was published, and it won awards, and Strange Horizons, who had rejected it, came to me and said, do you have a story about 5,000 words set in your Rachai universe, because we're going to have our fund drive and we would like to have it as a, when we've raised $5,000, we'll reveal the story. And I thought about it and I said, well, what I have is this story that y'all rejected last year. And so if you want that, they go, yeah, we want that. So that is freely available, but yeah, every now and then someone does ask me, when will we hear about that icon that Breck is carrying, right? The icon is there because of the short story. Because once I wrote the short story, I was like, ooh, now I have a prop to play with, right? I can put this in the story. So the story of who that head is that the icon is carrying and how that icon came to be, that's all in She Commands Me and I Obey.
First of all, thank you for the intriguing game of guessing who is which. Even in the translation of Emmanuel, he made some of the characters masculine enough and feminine enough to guess. Saladin, I guessed that he was a man, or a male of the species, only in the third book, because he started to have sexual relation with Commander.
No, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. In the first chapter...
But what I'm thinking about it, how did you approach Lieutenant Tissewick?
Oh, Lieutenant Tissewick.
She's not just about gender. She's about age. A young person and a very old person in the same body. How did you thought about this?
Kind of the same way I was thinking about gender, which is, Sevardin, for instance, Sevardin is Rachai. Right. When people say, what is Sevardin really? Sevardin is Rachai. Yeah. I mean, if you asked her, she would be like, why are you even asking me this question? Right. And with Tisarwat, you're right, Tisarwat is both kinds of people. Tisarwat is obviously very, very, very young. And Anandra and I is not very young. And so very young Tisarwat was this 3,000-4,000-year-old person for a while. And that was difficult. It was kind of fun to try and navigate how would you deal with that. And so I was just really intrigued by that contrast, right, and how to pull that off. And just how hard it is to be 17. It's hard to be 17, right? And that's an even harder way to be 17, yeah.
17 going on 4,000.
17 going on 4,000, yes, exactly.
Yes, please. First of all, I'd like to say that I love Breck. She's so interesting because AI, yet she's so morally evolved. So morally evolved. And then there's feelings too. I kept being surprised. How come she has to kind of deny her feelings just so she doesn't show up by whoever's looking at her so they can't guess what's really going on? Obviously she has feelings just like people do. And she has morals more than any other character except maybe On. So I'm wondering, did you give this to her like you gave her money, which is unlikely? Or is AI capable of evolving itself also in the moral direction and not just teaching itself technically, technologically?
So the question was about Breck having emotions and morals, and was that a thing that I gave her like I gave her money? Or was that a deliberate, my commenting on artificial intelligence?
And what is a person? I love
and yeah, what is a person? That's a tough...
The whole world that you built serves the purpose of grapple with that. I love that. I think it's a huge success.
Thank you. So with the feelings and emotions, one of the things when I did some reading about, I knew I was going to have to do some reading about neurology and neurochemistry and physiology because I knew that my artificial intelligences would see people very intimately in a very physical, intimate way and see how their hormone levels were and all these different things. And the more I looked at how human brains work, the more I became intrigued with the idea that if you're going to have an advanced artificial intelligence, it has to have emotions. The way that one of the difficult things when right now building artificial intelligences is to get them to make decisions that we find very easy, right? Very small little decisions. Do I want to write with a black pen or a blue pen? Do I want spaghetti for lunch or do I want curry? And we just go, oh, I think spaghetti. Oh, I think I'll use the blue pen. Those are very difficult decisions for artificial intelligences, right? And it turns out that with human beings, if you have the right kind of damage to your brain, where you don't interpret or feel particular emotions, you're going to feel them because they're very physical. People who have trouble processing their emotions have trouble making decisions. People who don't feel fear get themselves into trouble all the time because there's nothing to stop them from doing silly things. And you can't reason those out when you say, do I want spaghetti or curry? Well, you can sit there and go, well, the spaghetti will give me 50 more calories. The curry might be a little bit more nutritious. The spaghetti costs a little bit less. I mean, you can sit there for a day and finally decide, the next day that you want to have spaghetti. But by then you haven't eaten for a day, right? And everybody else you were going out to lunch with has left you behind, right? And gone to the spaghetti place. And the more I thought about that, the more I thought that if we're going to have advanced AI and it's going to make quick, complex decisions, it's going to need something like emotions to do it with. And then on top of it, Breck and the other ancillaries have human bodies. And as I said, emotion is a very physical thing. You feel it in your body, and so those bodies have emotions as well. So that character was always going to have some kind of emotions. And so I just decided to lean into that.
But she even thinks of charity to the sister who didn't get anything from whoever.
Well, yeah, yeah, a lot of that. Well, and some of that is emotional, right? When you see someone and you feel it, you see someone in pain, and you think, oh, if I felt that way, and that's an emotional reaction. I think sometimes in science fiction, we talk about pure supreme logic as the thing that will make us better, right? And I don't think that's true. I don't think we'll think more logically if we can leave our emotions behind. I think our emotions are an important part of how we decide what the best thing to do is. And when you cut those emotions away, you don't end up with good results, I don't think. So I said, that's where I'll stand on that then. Pure logic does not make things better, right?
I want to ask Jan about religion. Sorry. Just said this word. With our cultural evolution, Rajai is actually paganistic.
Yeah.
How come?
So for several reasons. One is that, of course, I'm used to monotheistic religion, and I wanted to play somewhere different. Very often in science fiction and fantasy, people recreate Christianity. They might call it something different, but it's very clearly just Christianity. And I wanted to sort of step beyond that and sort of think more about how it is people are religious. There's another thing in science fiction that happens very often. I'm sure you've all noticed where, it's Star Trek. Well, in the future, we're all too enlightened for religion.
Anne McCaffrey said her universe doesn't have religion because she wants it not to have one.
which is a perfectly legitimate choice to make. I mean, an author gets to choose what they're going to write about. But I am an atheist, but I find it really distasteful when someone says, well, in the future, we'll have evolved beyond religion. We'll all be too well educated and smart to be religious. And I'm like, really? You really think so? I mean, you've looked at all of human history, and you're actually looking at the people around you, many of whom are very smart, very good, very well-educated people, and you're saying, no, they're just stupid, and in the future we'll be smart enough and that no one will be like that? No, I don't think so. So I did very deliberately write about religion. I wanted religion to be in that society because I was making actually a very deliberate statement, which is there will be religious people, right? That's a thing. And there's no point going around, well, they're just deluded. Well, no, I mean, not actually. So kind of like the emotion, where I deliberately put in the emotion to say, no, pure logic is not the answer to all of our problems. I just wanted to say, no, we will not get to a miraculous future where only people who agree with you about this exist, right? Yeah, so, but also, reading lots of anthropology and history, there were a lot of shiny things in pagan-like religions, and I said, well, I'm just going to use all the shiny things that I came across.
That one, yep.
Breck is someone who's sort of a bit of a mystery to herself. I mean, when you were talking about emotion, I was thinking about the scene where tears are pouring down her cheek and she needs to be told that. And to think about how much of emotion is neurochemistry and sort of the biological computer. But she's also, because she's a mystery to herself, she's also this wonderful unreliable narrator. She's like trying to keep secrets from herself and others. How did you decide how much to keep hidden or how much to falsify and how much to reveal? How did you strike that balance?
It was tricky. Like the scene where she's crying, she knows she's crying, right? It's the reader who needs to be told she's crying, and she will never tell the reader she's crying because, no. She's very stoic, right? She's always competent, always in charge. She's never going to break down. No, right? She's always breaking down. She's always upset. So that was difficult, but I definitely wanted to, sometimes when you just say, I'm very sad, that's not as powerful as showing little hints of the sadness. And so I was trying to get that effect, that very, that visceral effect where suddenly you realize, oh my gosh, this person is terribly grief-stricken, right? This person is heartbroken, and they have been this whole time. And that's a very powerful realization. And so I was trying to get that. It was very difficult. That was one of the little things that I was always fine-tuning in all the drafts. It was tricky, though.
Yes. So we talked a lot about gender, but I was wondering about sexual orientation. So both, do you think that in the Raj there is a place for sexual orientation? Is there any variance in it? And regarding Bear herself, I saw her as kind of asexual maybe. Is that a thing? Is that all AIs or just her?
So yeah, that's kind of complicated. The question is about sexual orientation and does it exist in the Raj? And also, Breck, is she asexual, or and would that be true of all AIs? The question of sexual orientation in the Raj is difficult because they don't think of gender the way that we do. I don't doubt, because they're humans, that that different people are attracted to different sorts of people, but they wouldn't necessarily place any value on that. That would just be, oh, I like people who are shaped like this, right? Or I like people who act like this or do whatever. But I'm sure that it exists. In terms of Breck, Breck's situation is very complicated because she has a human body, and that body is going to have particular responses. But at the same time, she's also a ship. And there's no reason that a ship would have a human sexuality. And so ships have their own, I wouldn't say romantic, their own emotional orientation, which of course is ships love captains, right? Ships love people who can be captains. That whole conversation in the middle of Ancillary Mercy. So I think in terms of human sexuality, Breck would probably consider herself to be asexual. In terms of being a ship, Breck has a perfectly ordinary ship sexuality, right? Which is she loves someone who can be a captain. And of course there's a conversation between her and Mercy of Collard because, yeah, which is very complicated emotionally. But yeah, it's kind of muddled and messed up, and I kind of cheated, right? I could kind of step around it because Breck is a ship with a human body, yeah. Yeah, who shipped the ship with? In fact, I don't know if y'all have seen, there's a picture, it's a meme out on the internet, it's a picture of a great big boat that's carrying lots of boats, and it's a shipping ship, shipping ships, or something like that. A ship, shipping ships, shipping ships. And regularly somebody will send me a link to that.
Parts, shreds of beautiful songs. Can you finish them, please?
I see your shirt. I just now saw your shirt. The shirt says, "Oh tree, eat the fish." Well, that's awesome. Some of them are real songs. There are 3 real songs. L'Homme Armé is one of them. There are 2 songs. One of the things that, I haven't had time for it for a long time, but there's an American folk choral tradition called Shape Note. And so people just get together and sing out of these books. It's religious music. And there are two Shape Note tunes are in that first book, sort of translated into Rajchai and translated back out. And so those songs have more verses. But the others, once again, I kind of cheated. I only had to write the verses I wanted to write. Some people have written tunes for those. Someone wrote a tune for the Thousand Egg Song. And somebody, I think a couple of people have written tunes for My Heart is a Fish. Yeah.
I found it hard to realize how can the Raj, the ruler, would hide from himself the information of whatever happened. How did you think he could do?
So the question is, they found it difficult to conceptualize Anandramee and I hiding things from herself when she's all the same person. And some of that was, when I was thinking about Anandramee and I was thinking about ourselves. We experience ourselves as one unitary person. But there's a thing that happens, we have 2 hemispheres to our brain. And sometimes people who have a particular sort of very severe epilepsy, they're in danger of dying. And so the way to save their life is to cut the connection between the 2 hemispheres of their brain. And you get some very weird effects. When you talk to someone who's undergone this surgery, they'll talk about themselves as being one person. But if you just talk into one ear or the other ear and show them things to one eye and the other eye, it's like you're talking to 2 different people. It's really creepy. If you go on YouTube and you type in split brain patient, you can see some video. There was a documentary, and it's very strange. And so I thought about that, and I also thought about the way, if you think about it, there are things we kind of hide from ourselves sometimes, right? That we don't want to admit. Or things that we kind of push away and like, no, that's not a thing I'm going to pay attention to. And so I thought, well, if you had not just 2 hemispheres to your brain, but you had 10,000 brains, right, it would be a really weird thing. You'd be kind of like one person, but it would be easier to hide things from yourself, to only send out the information that you wanted or that you were comfortable with. And so I was kind of thinking about the way that we can sometimes be in conflict with ourselves and can sometimes be more than one person at the same time, even when we're obviously just one person.
Is there an important plot line or scene that you've changed because of your editor?
Is there an important plot line or thing that I've changed because of my editor? And the answer is no. I've been super lucky, right? The first book came out and I did some revisions for my editor. Well, when I sold the first book, there was some interest from other editors, not just the folks who had bought it. And one of the editors I spoke to on the phone, he says to me, so if we were to buy this book, I would want you to cut the first 100 pages, go straight to the action, and I'm not really liking the pronoun thing. And I was like, well, you know, you're a nice, smart guy, but I didn't. And I said, that's interesting. Yeah, I'm kind of married to the pronoun thing. I'm not, you know. And I got off the phone and I said, I can't work with him. He's perfectly nice and perfectly smart, and I can't work with him. And ended up selling the book elsewhere. And that editor said, you know, when I first read it, I thought, oh, the pronoun thing isn't quite working, but we'll fine-tune it, you know. He said, and then I went back and read it again, and I was like, oh, no, it fixed itself. Right? And so, and then he quit to write his own detective novel, which he won an award for, like an Edgar Award for Best First Novel or something. And my new editor came on board, and there wasn't anything for him to do. And then when the second book got turned in, the first book had won a whole bunch of awards. And it sold a bunch of copies. And so they were like, we think you should do this. And I was like, no. What are you going to do? Make me do it? You know, hold my fingers to the keyboard? I'm not going to do it, you know. And so I've been really lucky that way. But also, for those of you who are writers, this is actually an important piece of information because this is very scary. When you write your book and you sell it, and one of the big fears is the editor's going to make me ruin my book, right? The editor's going to take a knife to it, and it won't be what I wanted it to be. You can always say no, right? You can always say, I'm not going to do that. How about if I do this other thing that might make it work better for you, but it's very important for me to keep that talking dog, right? Or whatever it is. You can always say no. So don't be afraid of your editor. Your editor is just a person, right? You can always say, but always listen. Always consider what they say. But you don't have to do it. You don't have to be quite as you know, rude about it as sometimes I can be. Where no, I'm not going to do that. I would just they would send me revision notes, and I would just send back whatever I wanted, and then it would be the deadline, and what could they do? You don't have to do that. Don't do that. With the next year, in English, there will be a fantasy novel coming out, and in fact, there was a big back and forth over the ending, and the editor wanted me to make a big change to the ending, and I flatly refused to do it. And so there was a lot of back and forth, but that was me trying to make the ending I wanted work for the editor. I was not going to change the ending, right? So it's important to stick by the thing that you decide what you want out of your work, and then you stick with that.
Sometimes the editor... Okay.
Sorry, the time is up. So again, Anne, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure and a privilege.
Thank you.